Hi everyone, Tim Clapham here for FX PhD, and this is week 4 of the c4d215 course. And as you can see, I've opened up the scene that we were working with last week. I've made a few additions of this really simple kind of stage that I've created. Other than that, it's the same curtain that we were working with last week. And we're going to take this a little bit further. We're going to add some decoration in here in the form of drapes and swags. We're going to add some tassels onto the curtain, and we're going to create some new material. We've got a kind of silky material here. We're going to create more of a sort of heavy velvet. As far as the decorations go, I've got some reference here. Let me just open that up. Okay, and so you can see the kind of thing that I'm talking about, these kind of drapes. Here's another example. And we're not going to use cloth for this. We can build these as static objects. We don't need to have any simulation running on these. So that gives you an idea of the kind of thing that we're going to make. So let's just switch to our front view. I'm going to come up and add in a circle spline. Now it's a little bit busy with all this geometry in here. Let's switch off that symmetry and switch off the subdivision surface just for now. And let's just create some layers. So if we call this the decor, and then let's call this one stage and curtain, and then I'm just going to create one called scene as well, and I can put all my generic scene elements on there. So if we grab the stage group and just control drop that onto the stage layer, that means we can easily just hide that if we don't want to see it, or we could solo it if we just want to work on it on its own. And we can drop this onto our curtain layer with the wind and the belt as well. So now I'm just going to hide the stage and the curtain temporarily. In fact, I want to leave the stage up, but grab this circle that we've created and let's just pull this up so that we have a kind of nice drape in the middle. We create one here and then another one on either side. I'm going to just press C to make that editable, press K to bring up my knife, and let's just cut through somewhere like so. If we just press O to frame that object, I'm going to uncheck close spline, and I'm just using my live select, just delete these extra points that we don't need. So let's call this arc large. Using axis center, I'm going to just set the axis to be there at the top, and then I'm going to just control drag to create a duplicate. Call this arc small. Switch over to points mode. Let's select all the points, and if we use our modeling axes and we just set the Y to be 100% so that our axis is at the top here, we can press T, and then we can just scale this arc like so, almost so that it's flat. So now we've got this lovely smiling face. Let's just hide the stage for now. And you can see that the spline itself has visible segments. And that's because this angle is so subtle. And if we select these splines, you can see the angle here is set to 5. So it's not adding enough intermediate points. If we set that down to say 2, you can see that's looking a lot smoother. Okay, if we select the large arc that we've created, hold down the Alt key and let's add in a cloner, and we'll call this cloner drapes. And we also want to take the small arc and drop that in. Now by default, the cloner object is set to iterate through these. But what we want to do is we want to actually blend between these shapes. So we want to create a lot of intermediate splines between our large and our small arc, and we can do that simply by setting the mode or the clones parameter to blend. We need to set the position Y to 0 because we don't want to move them, and you can see that we now have 3 clones, and the center clone here is actually interpolating between those two. And you can use this blend feature with parametric objects, even lights, things like that, or you can use it with point-based objects such as splines, as we are now, or polygon objects. And you can effectively blend between 2 polygon objects. but you do need to make sure that the point count is the same, otherwise you might get some odd results. So let's set this count to, say, 18. So we've got quite a lot of splines there now. Let's come in and have a look at those. Now obviously if we render that, nothing's going to happen. We're not going to see the result of that. We can use a loft to create geometry. So if we add that and drop our cloner into there, and pretty dense, there's a lot of polygons there, so we're going to need to address that. You really need to try and optimize your scenes. Let's just switch these other two layers so they don't render. And there we go, you can see what we've created, and we've created this flat kind of happy smile. So to give this the illusion that it's kind of drapes of cloth, we need to offset our splines so we can create those kind of ripples through the geometry. And we can do that fairly easily. Let's just call this loft drapes. And we can do that with the formula effector. So if we select our cloner, choose MoGraph effector, and add in the formula effector. Let's just switch off the loft for now so we can see what's going on. And there you go, and you can see the result of that formula. Quite interesting, but definitely not the result we want. So what we need to do is we need to affect every other clone, and we can do that using the modulo formula. What modulo essentially does is it gives you the remainder after division. So we type mod, and we open brackets, and the next thing we want to do is link it to the ID or the index of the clone. In other words, the number of the clone. So we're going to put ID, and if you're unsure what values you can use in the formula, you can fold this variables down and it gives you some of the options here, and there we go, you can see ID is the object index, and because we want to affect every other, we choose semicolon and then 2 for every other clone. So it's a really simple formula, and you can use that for creating all sorts of things. Now what we need to do is come to the parameter tab. Let's uncheck scale, and you can see now if we come to our front view that every other clone is offset 50 centimeters on X. Well, we don't want to do that. We want to do that. We want to move them on Z. So we just set that to 0, and let's set Z to be, say, 1. If we come back to our perspective view, and let's come in and have a look, and hopefully you can see that now. You can see that every other spline is offset. If we enable the loft, it's going to become pretty clear, and you can see the result. So it's very simple, but it gives us a nice illusion of some draped cloth. Just to keep the scene tidy, I'm going to rename this formula drapes, and let's grab these and drag them onto this decor layer. Next we could add some braiding to this, or some tassels. Let's add some tassels first of all. I'm just going to control click on this tick, and that will disable all of those objects in that hierarchy, just so that we have a nice clean viewport to work with. Let's add in a circle. I'm going to set the radius of this to be 5, which is probably miles too big, but we can scale the whole thing down once we have it in place. Let's select this formula effector and set the fall off uncheck visible, just so that that's not in our viewport as well. So there's our circle. I'm just going to take that and control drag to create a duplicate, and let's hold down shift and move this across on X 10 units. Select both of these, press C to make them editable, and then right click and choose connect objects and delete. So now we have our double circle, and I'm going to use axis center just to center the axis like so, and then let's position this back at world 0. Next thing is to create a straight line, and there's a few ways of doing this. Let's just draw a linear spline. So I'm going to go to my front view, and let's just click twice, and in the coordinates manager I'm going to set that to be 0 on X minus 50, and then if we press UI to invert that selection, we set this to 0, Then we've got a spline that's 100 centimeters long. So with that spline selected, hold down the Alt key. Let's add in a sweep. And let's drop that double circle into there like so. And let's just call this tassel. Come back to our perspective view, and obviously this is going to be miles too big. But what I'd like to do now is actually add some twist to this, so that it's almost like a little bit of twisted rope or decorative string or something. So we can do this under the Object tab, and we have the option here to add some rotation. So let's set that to say 1200, so there's quite a lot of rotation. And you can see that the result that we're getting isn't exactly the result we're after. Now the reason for that is because we don't have enough segments, and if we switch to a mode where we can see the lines, it's very dense, but that's just from our circles. So we do need to try and optimize the amount of polygons. So first of all, let's select our double circle, and let's set that to be, say, uniform with a number of, say, 1. So now we've really reduced the amount of polygons there, but it's going to be pretty small. But if you notice along the length of it, we don't have any segments at all, which is why we're not seeing all those rotations. So to add the segments in there, of course, we need to subdivide this spline here. So I'm going to set this to be uniform. Okay, and you can immediately see the result. Not exactly the result we're after, but if we increase the count here, like so, let's set that to say 70, and now you can see the result of that. So I don't think we really want to actually rotate it quite that much. Let's say 720. Let's grab this spline, and I'm just going to make that a little bit longer, say 150%. We can see faceting from the edges of the polygons where it's quite a low res mesh, but these are going to be really small, and there are going to be quite a few of them, so there's probably too much geometry, to be honest, but let's leave it as it is for now. Switch over to points mode, select this spline, and let's just select that top point. It's already selected. And with axis center, we'll set the axis to selected points and click execute, and that will then position the axis for our spline at that top point. With that spline selected, we can then choose parent to and click execute, and now we have our sweep, which has also got its axis there, which is perfect. So now if we add in a cloner, set this to be object mode. If we fold down our loft and we grab this arc large, what we want to do is drop that into the object field. And there we go, and you can see that we now have these tassels along the arc that we created. If we just enable this loft, these are probably the biggest tassels ever known. So we're obviously going to need to scale those down. The tassels need to point straight down, so we don't need to align the clone, so we can uncheck this option, and this will just stop the clones aligning to the normals. Okay, there we go. Now if your axis is slightly different orientation, you can of course switch to the transform tab and you can adjust the rotation there. But that's looking great. I think the count needs to be much higher, and obviously these need to be much smaller. So let's just first of all select that tassel, press T, and let's scale that right down. Something like that. So it's about 10% of the size that it was. Coming back to the cloner, let's set the distribution to be even, and let's increase the count. Something like so. So I've got about 90 there. If we now render that, and there we go. And just that little twist on there will make that look a little bit more interesting as the light catches it. But of course we have got this issue of the cloth being perfectly flat, or the drape, and the tassel not really sitting on there very well. what I'm actually going to do is hold down Alt under the Transform tab, and we can then just move that back slightly, and we can move it up a little bit, just so it sits behind, like so, and that will look a little bit cleaner. And if we add some braiding into this as well, we can hide that with some decoration. It's so dense, the amount of polygons, we really need to do something about that. So let's come in here, let's just set that to 0 for our double circle. Maybe that's a little bit too coarse. Might look nice when you're further away. Nice surface for the light to catch on. Okay, we'll set that back to 1. Let's just reduce the number of points along the length of that sweep. Now let's come to this loft. Of course, this is got a huge amount of subdivisions, and we can adjust that in both directions. So I'm going to set that down to say 5, maybe even lower, 3. We don't want to lose the drapiness of it, but we also don't want to be having millions of polygons if they're not needed. Add our tassels to the decor layer as well. Now let's add some braiding or some trim along here. Included in the download there should be an image. Let's just jump over to Photoshop quickly. So this is the image that's included, and you can see it's just a piece of braiding that's been made seamless. And we have an alpha channel. So we can bring that into our cinema project. So I'm going to create a new material, call this braid. Let's just set that to be a plane. Come to the basic tab and enable alpha. Under the color tab, I'm going to load the image into the texture slot. And let's just drag and drop this into the alpha as well. In fact, let's enable bump, and let's just drop that onto the bump as well. Very basic material. So to run this along here, probably the easiest way is to just use a sweep. So if we select the arc large, and if I switch to points mode, you can see the points of that. So we can see that arc. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create an instance of this. And if we use this to sweep along, that means if we do change the arc on our actual drapes, then the sweep will adjust as well, because it's an instance of the same spline. So let's hold down Alt and add in a sweep. And with that sweep selected, hold down Shift and let's add in a rectangle spline. Obviously it's going to be miles too big, so let's just scale that down. Like so. And if we press C to make that editable, and I just want to zero that out so that we can see it. Let's uncheck close spline, and let's delete some of these points. As you can see, we just want this thin strip like so. So now if we then just set the axes, there we go. And so you can see that we have this geometry along here. Let's just move that very slightly forward. Something like so. And let's just grab our braid material and drop that on. And then we want to select that tag, and let's just increase the tiling somewhat. Set that to say 5. And there we go. So that kind of adds some decoration, and it also hides the join for our tassels. Let's grab this gold material that is already in the scene, drop that onto the tassels, and let's double click to create a new material. We've already got this silky material, but let's create a velvet material. First thing to do for the material is to set the illumination model. So if we switch to the illumination tab and let's change that to Auranea, that's a kind of more suitable for rough and cloth type materials. I'm also going to just increase the diffuse fall off. It just makes it a tiny little bit more contrasty. And let's increase the roughness as well up to about 120. If we come back to the color channel, let's add in a Fresnel shader, open that up, and I'm going to choose some kind of pinky, deep purple kind of colors. And let's make this one a bit darker. And the great thing with the Fresnel shader is that as our cloth ripples, the polygon angle is going to change depending on whether it's facing the camera or perpendicular, will determine which color it picks along this gradient. Let's drop that into a layer shader. And there's a shader that we can use which isn't often seen, but it's a very handy little shader. It's similar to subsurface scattering, but it works more on the illumination across the surface rather than the illumination within a volume. And if you were like making something like a peach, it's sort of the perfect shader to create that nice, soft, fluffy surface. So it should work quite well for velvet. And the shader is called Chandlam. So if we go shader, effects, and add in Chandlam. Now normally you'd put this in the luminance channel, but it will work in the color channel. And it does just generate white. But what Chandlam does is it essentially, where a ray hits the surface, it then sends out a whole bunch of samples. And if we open this up, you can see that you can define the number of samples. So the lower we set this, the noisier it is, but the quicker it will render. If we increase the number of samples, it will become much smoother, but it will also become slower. And the radius determines how far these samples are sent out. So imagine if we have the corner of an object, some of the samples are actually going to go round that corner, and it gives the illusion that the light is almost going around the corner. So you get this kind of fake subsurface scattering effect. I'm just going to leave the settings at their defaults, and I'm going to set this to, say, overlay. Now that is going to be a little bit contrasty, so let's just duplicate that shader, and we'll set this top one to be soft light and just bring the opacity down to about 30. And let's grab this for now, hold down Control and drag that to the top, and let's set that to multiply. Let's come back up, switch to the specular channel. I'm going to make this a nice sort of light pink to complement the colours that we've already got, and it's much too bright, so let's just reduce the height of this down to say 8. That looks okay. Next, let's come back to the color channel, open up that layer shader again. I just want to right click and copy that for now, and I'm going to add some luminance and paste it into there. Now that is a bit full on, of course, so we're going to reduce the brightness of the color right down to 0, and then we're going to reduce the mix strength of this shader down to around 15. So it's quite subtle, but you can see we're getting quite a nice look going on already. Let's come back to the basic tab, enable diffusion. Let's also enable some bump. Under diffusion, I'm going to simply add in some noise. I'm going to set this to affect the luminance as well. Let's open up that noise and set that global scale down to around 1. So it's really, really fine. Now, just to make this a bit more interesting, let's combine another noise. So let's drop that into a layer shader, duplicate that noise. Let's open up this bottom one. Let's set the black to be much lighter. So we're essentially reducing the contrast there. And let's choose a noise from in here, VL noise, and I'm going to set the scale of this up to about 250. And let's set that top noise to multiply, and that just makes that a bit more interesting. Now we don't want that diffusion to be set quite so high. You can really see the effect of that. Let's pull that right down to around 30, 35. Grab this layer and drop that onto bump, and let's set that bump to be about 5. Now if we take this material and let's drop that onto our loft, and let's have a look, and there you go, and you can see the result of that. Let's unhide everything else in the scene for a moment. Okay, and we drop this velvet onto the existing texture tag on our curtain as well. I'm going to come up and add in a target light, and let's pull this around so it's actually pointing at the front. Let's pull this target up a little bit, and I'm going to set this light to have shadow maps, and let's set that shadow map just about 500, say. And there we go. So you can see that new kind of velvety material. Okay, I've obviously got the tassels, etc. on the wrong side, but we can easily just group all of that and rotate it. Before we do that, let's come up and just save this project. I'm going to just fix these tassels where I've done them back to front. Sorry about that. Let's just, we should just be able to set that to minus there, like so, and let's just set that to a positive value like so. So that should look a little bit better when we render it now. There we go. It's almost, the tassels are almost too big for the size of the curtain, and definitely too big. The other thing as well is that there are a lot of these, and there's a lot of geometry. I think that we should almost have twice as many. Let's say 150. This is going to give us a bit of a performance hit because we do have quite a lot of geometry in there. But one thing we can do to speed up rendering, or make sure that we don't run out of memory, is we can enable render instances, and that will mean that it renders much faster because it only has to calculate one of those tassels essentially, and then it uses that to render all of them. It's a much more memory efficient solution. Now we do need a couple more of these, so I'm going to just duplicate this setup and scale them to fit into the sides, and by the power of video recording, that's going to take me about this long. Done. So here we go, you can see it's essentially the same, just duplicated the setup. We've got a few more of those, and when we render, it's starting to look quite nice. Okay, the last thing that I want to do is to add in some tassels along the bottom of our curtains. Now we could do that with the cloner as well, but the problem with that is they're going to be very static, and it'd be nicer if we could have some dynamic motion. So what we can do is we can use hair, and we can use hair to generate the geometry along the bottom here. And as we move the cloth, the hair will also move with it, and we'll get some really nice dynamic motion. With this curtain, however, at the moment we've got it in symmetry. I'm not going to do two different curtains. If this was a real project, then obviously I would do two sims. It's also cached at the moment, so let's just press play. Now you're going to notice that everything slows down a little bit. Now one of the reasons for that is because we've got all of this decor and all of this geometry in the scene, and you can see that my scene is playing pretty badly. If we just solo that curtain, you can see the speed up that we get immediately. So that's a good reason to be using layers, is that you can isolate the different elements that you're working on and you won't get a performance hit. Obviously with animation it's important to see it as real time as possible, so anything you can do to speed up the viewport, do it. With the curtain at the moment it's infinitely thin. It's just a polygon thickness. If we come in and have a look at, let's just switch off this symmetry. You can see here that we have this wafer thin curtain. So to give it a little bit more body, we can give that some thickness, and we can do that just with a cloth NURBS or a cloth surface. So if we hold down Alt with that curtain selected and choose Simulate Cloth, add in a cloth surface. It's called cloth NURBS in earlier versions. Let's drop that onto the same layer. Now we don't want to use any subdivisions here, so we set that to 0, but I do want to have a thickness of about 1, and that will just make the curtain a little bit nicer when it's rendering, because you'll have a slight bit of thickness on there. Of course, that's going to slow things down as well, so maybe you want to disable these while you're running all your simulation tests. Let's hide the decor and the stage for a moment, and let's switch these off so we just have our curtain geometry. I'm going to switch over to edge mode. If we come in and select this very first edge here, in fact it's this one round here, and then come all the way to the other end, like so, and if we just press Shift and Control and click on this edge, it will select all those edges in between. With those edges selected, choose Select, Set Selection, and we'll call this a bottom edge. So we've now got an edge selection here that we can use to grow the hair on. Let's come up to the Simulate menu, choose Hair Objects, Add Hair, and I've got the curtain and the selection selected. So when we add hair, it's going to automatically add that edge selection into the link, and you can see there we have our hair, and it automatically grows along the normals. What we need to do is change the roots, instead of polygon vertex to polygon edge. Under growth it's set to normals, which is fine. They're obviously much too long, so I'm going to set the length of them to be 10. I'm going to set the count much higher, say 500. Under the hairs tab, I'm just going to choose as guides, so we control everything from our guides. We probably don't need 8 segments. Let's set that to 4, so everything will be running a bit quicker. And now we have the issue that because they're pointing along the normals, they're pointing the wrong way. So let's select our cloth tag first of all, just uncheck the cloth engine, so now when we press play we don't get a cloth simulation. Okay, and you can see there's something weird happening here, and that is because we have this wind. We added that last week just to add some kind of turbulence to our cloth, but we don't really want that to affect our hair. So let's select our hair, switch to the Forces tab, and then we've got an exclude list here, so we can drag that wind in there and exclude that wind from affecting our hair. So now when we press play, okay, you can see that's dropping down. Now it's not dropping all the way down and stopping like so, because in our stage here we have a cube. Let's just make this visible. And this is the floor of the stage. And on here I've already added a hair collider tag. So you can add that from the hair tags, hair collider. If we delete that, you can see that the hair will carry on dropping down. Now you'll notice that with the hair, although it's dropping down, it's still sticking out at kind of 90 degrees at the very top. Now the reason for this is because hair has an option under the Dynamics tab, Properties, Hold Roots. Now Hold Roots is designed so that if you have hair on a head, it doesn't lay perfectly flat on the polygons. Actually, this parameter lifts the roots up slightly. So it means that the very root of the hair will still come out at 90 degrees to the surface, along the surface normal. So if we want that to hang totally flat, we need to set that hold roots to 0. Then let's rewind and press play again, and you can see there we go. Now our hair drops down. It's probably not enough tassels there. We've got some gaps, so we can come to our guides and we can increase that count. Let's set that to say 800. And the other thing that we need to do is we don't want the tassels to be dropping like that. We want them to be pointing downwards from the very beginning. So let's just come to the Dynamics tab, come down to Animation, and you can see we have this option here to relax, and that's very similar to pressing play. And if we hit relax, it will essentially internally run through 10 frames. You can press it again. So what we might want to do here is just set that to say 100 and then just relax 100 frames. There we go, and I've just done that twice, and you can see that that's not moving at all. But the thing is, if I press play and come back, then they all jump back up again. So we need to set that position as the initial starting position for our hair dynamics. Once you're happy that the hair is relaxed enough, come up to the Simulate menu, choose Hair, Edit, Set as Dynamics, and that will then set that hair position as the initial starting point. So now if we press play, we come back to the beginning, you can see that the hair is all hanging down. I think it would be quite cool if the tassels land on the stage, and we did have the hair collider tag. I've deleted that, but we can add that back on. But at the moment, the hair itself is of course going through that floor. You can see that there. So we really need to raise the whole curtain up so it can drop down, and all the tassels can sit on the floor, and we should get some nice interaction as the curtain opens with the tassels hitting the floor as well. Will help to, sell the effect. Currently we have our cloth tag disabled, which is cool. So let's just grab our belt and grab our curtain, and let's just lift that up. I'm going to lift it up so it's just almost sitting on the floor, the tassels, because the cloth will drop down very slightly. What we need to make sure we do is we need to make sure that we reset the initial state for our cloth. At the moment we have a cache, we've got that cached, so we need to clear that. So first of all, let's come to the Dresser tab and choose Initial State Set. Let's come to Cache and let's empty that cache, and now we should be able to enable our cloth engine. Thing is, as soon as we do that, the hair disappears. So you do need to make sure that you get your cloth sim working, cache that, and then the hair will work. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to just come out. I'll leave the animation as it is. It's a bit jerky the way it pulls in, but what I want to do is I want to set the iterations up to around 25, maybe even higher, and I want to set the mass much higher, up to around 1,000, so that it's much heavier, stiffer cloth. Now let's just calculate the cache. Okay, that's done. So now you can see the hair reappears on there, but when we press play, you can see the result, and it's a little bit erratic. Obviously the animation needs work, but you can see how the hair is now reacting to that motion. So you might want to just grab this hair, maybe increase the drag, maybe increase that even more. Just makes those tassels look like they're a little bit stiffer. Of course, we don't really want to render those tassels as hair, so that's another thing that we need to think about. I'm not actually sure if they're quite hitting the stage. Yeah, I think they are, yeah, because as it drops down. So what we need to do as well is add that tag back onto our stage. So I'm going to right click, choose Hair Tags, Hair Collider. Let's just have a look from here, and there we go, and you can see now, as it drops down, the tassels sit on that floor, which is kind of what would realistically happen. Okay, we can of course enable all of our other elements. We won't have hair on both sides because the symmetry won't work with the hair, so you'd need to set this up for both curtains. Now we don't really want to render this as hair, as I just said. What we want to do is render some geometry here, so there's a couple of ways that we can do that. If we select the hair and we go to the Generate tab, at the moment it says Render Hairs. Well, we don't want to render any hairs. We can choose here to generate something else, so we can generate splines, or we can generate kind of some flat geometry. Let's just choose circle, And you can see if I deselect that, now we have all these kind of tubes that have been added on. The size of these is controlled through the hair material, which is a little bit strange. But what we can do is select our hair material, come to the thickness tab, and if we set the tip and the root to be 0.1, you can see that that's reflected on the geometry itself. There's also an issue with the fact that we are adding our hair to the unsubdivided mesh. So you do get a slight difference here, but when that's in motion you probably won't see that, and it would be nice to add some braiding along the bottom of here to kind of hide that join anyway. So now if we press play, you can see that everything slows down a little bit, but now we have some geometry here that when we render you can actually see the result of it. There's a little bit of a lag there because of the geometry. We can probably fix that just by pulling the hair down and placing it below the actual curtain mesh. We can also grab that gold material that we used on the tassels at the top, and we can drop that onto the hair, and then when we render we can have nice gold tassels. Now if we wanted to use the actual tassel that we created earlier rather than using the geometry generated by the hair engine, we can do that as well. If I open up these drapes and grab this sweep tassel, I'm just going to copy that and paste it into a new scene. Can't see it. Oh, it's hidden. The layers are hidden. Okay, so there we go. And you can see that the Z axis is pointing along the length of our object. I'm just going to press C to make this editable and then connect and delete this, and let's just call this tassel. Okay, and let's just come back to our original scene and paste that into here. If we select the hair and we come to the generate tab, we have the option here to generate instance. If we choose instance, then we get a new option in the attribute manager, and we can then drag our tassel into that field. And there we go. You can see that took a little bit of time to redraw, and it's incredibly geometry heavy. We probably need to make this a bit thicker. Let's just make it very thick for a moment so we can see the result. There we go. So the reason it's looking bizarre is because it's actually adding this along the wrong axis. So we need to select this and choose axis Z. And there we go. So we do need to make it much thinner. Let's make it 0.25. And then let's render. And there we go. So now you can see we've used a custom object in place of the hair itself. And of course you can spend a bit more time making a more realistic tassel, but hopefully that should give you some idea. But you can see how much that's slowing down my scene by having that real geometry tassel as part of the hair. So you will get a much better performance if you choose one of these other options, but you won't get such a nice result perhaps. Okay, there we go. So that brings us to the end of this week's class, and this week we had a look at using MoGraph to build our decor. We added in some tassels, we created a nice velvet material, and finally we've been using hair to add tassels to our cloth simulation to create some more dynamic elements within our scene. So I hope you enjoyed the class. If you've got any questions, please ask them on the forums. Other than that, I'll catch you all next time. Thank you.